What is hidden that lies beneath the Oracle of Delphi, just about 2 hours' ride north of Athens, Greece? The Oracle of Delphi was the most famous oracle of ancient Greece and of the then known world. It's located in Delphi. It's considered the navel of the world because, according to tradition, when Zeus released two eagles, one to the east and one to the west, they met at Delphi. It was dedicated to the god Apollo. Pithia was the sorceress, the medium with whom the god communicated and gave the oracles which were recorded. Every 4 years, the Pythian Games were held in honor of Apollo, and which Angelos Sikelianos tried to revive. In the same area, a primitive oracle existed from earlier times in which the goddess Earth, Gaia, was worshipped in the Mycenaean era. Statuettes of the goddess have been found in the ruins of the temple of Athena Pronia as well as that of Apollo. The reason for the establishment of an oracle was the existence of a chasm from which gases came out, thus allowing people to pass into a state of a trance. Over time, more gods were worshipped along with Earth, Gaia, that is. According to mythology, the guardian of the oracle was the dragon Python, who was killed by Apollo. In the geometric period, the oracle came under the authority of Apollo, as evidenced by the change from clay female figurines to bronze male figurines. In the Iliad written by Homer, it's mentioned as a rich and holy place. The visitors, Delphi is on the side of a gorge. It's a fault system that has been opened up, and it's on the side of the mountain. Now, the visitors who sought an oracle from Pithia at Delphi were called theopropes, and according to the ritual of the oracle, they had first to be purified with water from Castalian spring, paying a certain tax, the so-called pelanon, which was not the same for all, while they had to offer a sacrifice in the temple of Apollo, usually a goat. The animal had to have no blemish, while a necessary omen for the Pithia to give an oracle was for the animal to begin to tremble after it had first been doused with cold water. Among the theoprophets, there was the hierarchy as to who took precedence in the giving of money. The first people entitled to receive an oracle were the people of Delphi. They were followed by those who had been honored by Delphi with the privilege of presbytery, and then the rest. Within the last two groups, the order was decided by lot. Similar purification rituals were followed by the Pithia. After some formal procedure, she'd go down to the so-called aviton, where she would listen to the questions from the priests who were in an adjacent small space called a house, and she would then fall into a trance while the priest recorded and interpreted the words she spoke. The oracle was overseen by 5 men, each of whom belonged to one of the 5 great families of Delphi, called the Dephkalionides. They were called the faithful, and while their leader was the prophet, initially the oracles were given only once a year, on the 7th of the month of Vicius, Apollo's birthday. With the increase in the attendance of the oracles were given on the 7th of every month, except for the winter ones, as then, according to the myth, Apollo left Delphi and went to Hyperborea, that is, to the Arctic. These oracles, whose nature became known to us both from inscriptions and from the works of ancient authors such as Herodotus, constituted a law of the Greek world of the time, making the oracle a kind of arbiter for very important matters such as wars or colonization, giving it so huge power. Now, the laws of Sparta, for example, were introduced by Lycurgus with the authority of the Oracle of Delphi, while the colonies in Lower Italy were founded following the oracle's orders. In the period of 7th and 6th century BC, with the increase of interest in new colonies, the Oracle of Delphi knows its greatest heyday, as several expeditions were launched after an oracle from the oracle. These honored Apollo as chief, while several took the name Apollonia. Oracles in earlier times were known for their ambiguous meaning. There were several times when the oracle did not take an impartial stance but openly took the side of a faction, as for example in the Peloponnesian War when it took the side of the Spartans, Lacedaemonians. However, her services were given to everyone regardless of political situation that prevailed in their areas. The descriptions of the legend of the Oracle of Delphi concerning the Pithia and her communication with Apollo through vapors belonging to the realm of the unreal and perhaps myth, in the opinion of some archaeologists. In 1892, French archaeologists began excavating in the area of the sanctuary of Delphi in order to find something to prove that there was indeed a chasm that allowed the gases to emerge and create the communication channel between Pithia and Apollo. But they failed to find anything to prove it, and so the legend remained in the realm of myth. It was not until the late 1990s that a team consisting of an archaeologist, a toxicologist, a chemist, and a geologist who supported, if the opposite, and according to their theory, the naval rock on which the Pithia sat and uttered her oracles amid the fumes was directly above a chasm created by the slippage of the subterranean plates, leaving a passage for the fumes of gases such as ethane and methane to rise to the surface of the soil and be inhaled by the Pithia. The navel. It's known that if someone inhales a small amount of ethylene, they get into a state of euphoria and hallucinatory visions are created. When Pithia was in that state of communication with Apollo and the questions and advice were asked, Pythia's answers were given incoherently. She became delirious and spoke gibberish. The priests of the sanctuary were the ones who translated, quote unquote, and gave some meaning to what she was saying. The answers of the oracle were always wise and provident, and that is why the oracle was respected and so famous and an integral element of the Greek way of life. But what is not widely known is that the late professor of archaeology and rector of the University of Athens, Pyrrhidos Marinatus, in 1958-59, wrote an interesting study entitled Delphic Chasma and the Spirit of Pithia, which was the main topic of his rector's speech in the ceremony hall of the University of Athens in the presence of the then royal couple, Paul and Frederique, having in his hands tangible evidence of the existence of the chasm that was the communication channel between Pithia and the Spirit of God. Therefore, he preceded his findings by 30 years from the foreign scientists. He states that newer science has ruled out the case of the chasm because it was not discovered by excavations, but according to the ancient testimonies, the gap existed. The first to mention it is Diodorus Siculiotis, and according to him, goats grazing nearby discovered the properties of the chasm because as soon as they approached it, they squealed and made a special sound. Their shepherd, when he approached and stooped out of curiosity into the chasm, was overcome with the same excitement and began to foretell the future. The same happened to others who jumped into the chasm and perished. This is how the oracle became known, and it was thought that it belonged to the earth, Gaia. Diodorus said that the chasm lay where the shelter of today's sanctuary is. Strabo says the same, adding, however, that from the cave that was not wide mouth, an exciting spirit air was sometimes stronger and sometimes weaker. Pliny adds that anathemiasis, that is, gases that were escaping, was among the first similes which created a divine state of inspiration. Of particular importance is the testimony of Plutarch, who was a priest in Delphi for 20 years. I didn't even know that. In two of his treatises on the remaining vestiges and on the Pythian, who did not measure the present day, he talks about the Delphic problems. He mentions the chasm and the air rising from it many times, but he never said that the chasm was in the sanctuary of the temple. He also states that the flatulence was not constant, but sometimes mild and sometimes severe. He also invokes witnesses that the rising spirit is at irregular intervals full of fragrance. He characteristically asserts that this fragrance filled the house where those who were waiting for the oracles were sitting, and it came from the shelter. Now, in a way, the way in which he talks about the rising air leads to the conclusion that it's not the sanctuary of the temple. In particular, he uses the following sentence regarding the fact that the Pithia no longer gives measured oracles. Quote, either of the two must happen, or the Pithia does not approach the place where the sulfur is, or the vapor is completely extinguished and its power dissipated, end quote. As two of them, or the Pithia, not wandering in the villages while it is divine, or of the spirit extinguished and strength left. On the other hand, he confirms the tradition of Diodorus about the discovery of the chasm by goats, and mentions the name of the shepherd, that his name was Coritas. It also gives us another veiled allusion to the gap using a set design. He represents the heroes of the dialogue coming to the temple to sit on the meridian platform and talk with the sanctuary of Gaia in front of him. Then Vothis says that the place of the question is included in the stranger. That is, the place also helps to discuss Pythia's current lack of inspiration. However, there's no talk of fumes, but of muses and yarn. But we already know that with the sanctuary and the original oracle of earth, the fumes of the chasm are connected. The sanctuary of the earth, Gaia, was discovered during the excavation exactly where Plutarch mentions it, in front of the meridian side of the temple. Geramopoulos, in the Guide to Delphi, 1935, states, it is the ancient sanctuary of the earth, Gaia. There was the chasm and the rising breath. Shortly after the construction of the then new hotel on the edge of the city of Delphi, Marinatos, the archaeologist, heard during his passage there in March 1959 that they were talking about the wind hole, quote unquote, which was partly cut off by the road alignment. Geramopoulos spoke of a crack at the western edge of the village and visited the site. He found the chasm, put his head inside, and immediately felt the breath of an outgoing wind. He photographed the spot and wrote an article in the daily paper recommending to the tourist office to see to it that the chasm is not further damaged. In January 1959, he went back to Delphi, but the gap had disappeared. During the new widening of the road, the rock was blown up, and part of the hole that was left was filled with stones and earth. However, he found the small remaining trace of the chasm with the help of an old photograph, but he still doubted it because the landscape had changed dramatically. As he characteristically writes, the final proof was provided by the gases escaping from there. The spirit was always there, coming out through the stones and earth. They wear this emanating warmth, and this warmth is made more intense by the frosty day. Marinatus believed that the fissure is one and only, which running from east to west passes through the sanctuary and sometimes emits the fumes within it, probably to the sanctuary of Gaia. Due to the continuous severe earthquakes, the rocks probably underwent a slight movement, from which one mouth was closed and others opened in the wind hole. The water of Castalia Spring moved many times in the past, and in 1870 due to earthquakes. Castalia, the spring, he also considered it possible that the wind hole was a branch of the Delphic chasm, or even an entirely independent chasm. However, the fact remains that near the sanctuary there is this phenomenon about which antiquity has spoken and covers the various ways in which the spirit is described. Regarding the ancient sources from the chasm, archaeologist Marinatus points out that they are not older than the 1st century BC. Diodorus, who is the oldest, at the same time gives rise to the questioning of the whole issue of the chasm and vaporization, because he mentions that they took place in the abode of the sanctuary, and moreover the frequent expression that the Pithia descended into the shelter led to a series of misunderstandings. Adito, that is where people can't enter, was considered the part of the temple behind the nave, where in some ancient temples there was a separate compartment which was given the name Adito. It was only the high priest that could go in there. The temple of Apollo in that section was excavated internally up to the natural rock, which happened to be discovered solid and absolutely intact. Undoubtedly, there never was a gap there because the Pithia was descending 2 floors were accepted in the sanctuary of the temple due to traces of steps. But was this really the refuge of the chasm? Keramopoulos already made the correct observation that internally the walls of the temple do not bear a face in the excavated part, therefore it was never intended to be visible. Delphi of the past century. The earliest accounts, which are all poetic, are vague and open to flexible interpretation. The relatively clearer spirit is pinned O. Goldsmith Evodius from the hidden temple, gases emanating from the hidden temple before said, darker is the reason in Pithia, gold as a hidden tripod treasure. In a chorus, Castalia spring, it is impossible to conclude which Adito Euripides means. Also in Evmenides or Jonah, the reader will read the following. In the temple there is, where the navel is, there were thrones around there. When Pithia saw the Evmenides sleeping, and all these are found in the space, where is also the statue of the god. In Iona, the story about the navel is repeated, where Phoebus sits singing hymns, and there the tripod is mentioned, the tripod where Pithia would sit, around which the elites of Delphi stand inside the temple without any other details. Entrance and exit to the temple are mentioned everywhere, and nowhere getting down, not even explicitly the shelter. Therefore, since the shelter of the temple did not show traces of use in the deeper layers, we must think whether the descent which is witnessed in later sources means another shelter outside the temple. Diodorus uses the phrase that the chasm was in this place as it was now the sanctuary called Aditon. So we notice first of all that holy does not mean only a temple, but also the whole holy, exactly in the opposition to the temple. And secondly, if it was a temple, there would be no need to use the phrase the so-called Aditon, since Aditon was a normal name for the relevant part of the temples. When we combine the news that the Pithia came down to this refuge, we're led to the conclusion that it was outside the temple, in a deeper place, possibly around the sanctuary of Gaia, such shelters within the temples in which they also existed elsewhere in Greece. Such is the sanctuary of the Isthmus in Corinth, where Pausanias describes within the enclosure of Paleon. On the left, a temple. There is also another one called Aditon, and go down into the underground where Paleon is hidden. The analogy between the Aditos of the two sanctuaries is important, since in both descriptions a phrase the so-called Aditon is used. In addition to the traditions, Python was buried in the shelter of Delphi and Paleon was buried on the Isthmus. There's also a testimony of Herodotus. It's known that these chasms of the earth, as well as the related underground spaces, were called shelters and mansions. So Herodotus mentions the oracle that the Athenians received about the imminent invasion of Xerxes of the Persians. The priests, after performing the relevant ceremonies, entered the palace and went. Pithia then talks about the hopeless disaster which hangs over Athens and ends. Therefore, Megaron and Aditon are presented as synonyms, and it was probably one and the same. In the vestibule in which the stranger sat, and in the background was a chasm from where the Pithia gave her prophecies. Plutarch's description is in complete agreement with them, with the only difference being that the place where the god stained sit is here called a house, and it's filled with fragrance at random intervals from the spirit of the adjacent Aditos. According to Pausanias, the water of Castalia spring arrived inside there, and the drinking of which was one of the elements of divine ecstasy. We don't know what and where Castalia was. However, many traces of tanks and pipelines were found, which from the 6th century BC, they led the water around the temple. Archaeologist Marinatus claims that careful monitoring of these pipelines may facilitate the discovery of the abyss as well as the chasm. And the sources were Delphic Chasm and the Spirit of Pithia by archaeologist Piers Marinatos, and I've translated this for you from a Greek article. Please leave your comments, and thank you for your support. Kindly support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.